Good morning, everyone. I want to thank everyone for joining us for this webinar, Considerations for Bariatric Victims. My name is Lee Santel. I'm with the Rockland County Sheriff's Office in New York. It's really good to have everybody here with us today. A little bit of information about our center. We are the smallest county in New York outside of New York City, outside of the 5 boroughs of New York City. And even though we're small, we do have fairly large population at 330,000 and an annual call volume for our semi-consolidated PSAP of about 208,000 calls per year. So a little bit of information about our center. There's my contact information up on the screen. I encourage you after the webinar is over, or if you're watching this on demand later, by all means, please feel free to send me an email or check out our website. If there's some information, there's not much on the website, but certainly you're welcome to send me an email or give me a call if you want to discuss anything, if you have any questions, if you have any suggestions, if you have any feedback. I'd love to hear from you. Most importantly, I do encourage you to check out our Facebook page, which is on the screen there, 44 Control. We offer quite a bit of in-house, and also we're starting to go ahead with some electronics and webinar training, which I'm hoping to offer again in the future. So we post our training opportunities generally to Facebook first on our Facebook page. So I do hope you'll check out our Facebook page and follow us for all of our training opportunities that we do offer. And today we're going to be talking about considerations for bariatric victims, which is something that we've been getting a few more calls on than we used to. Perhaps not every call, perhaps not every day, but perhaps not even every week. But certainly I feel like we're getting at least one a month. Maybe a little more. And we really wanted to develop a webinar that would discuss some of the challenges that we wanted our dispatchers, our telecommunicators to know about when they're sending responders out to these calls, and some things that we're thinking about doing and your center might think about doing in terms of getting ready to sort of like dispatch planning for when these sorts of calls occur. So we'll talk about some challenges that responders have when they are going out for calls involving these obese patients. And especially we'll talk about some of the challenges that responders face when it comes to airway control, which is something some telecommunicators don't realize. If you've never been out in the field for one of these patients, for one of these victims, you might not be aware that that's actually a big problem in some cases. And in almost all of these cases, or the majority of them, getting the person out of the building, removing them from the building can be a real challenge for responders, and that's where things sort of start to get hokey for the telecommunicator as well. We'll talk about some of the ways that responders deal with some of these issues by some of the tools and equipment that they have available to them, which again, your agencies, your local response agencies might have. They might not have, and if they don't have, you're going to need to know where to get it, so we'll talk about that. The same thing going for the personnel, for the manpower. These calls typically require a lot of extra manpower, a lot of extra personnel. You just need more hands to get the job done, and it takes a longer time, so that's going to be a challenge for both the responders and the dispatchers. And we'll talk a little bit at the end about what your center can do, or some things that your center might consider doing to prepare for these sorts of incidents, to prepare for these sorts of calls, and how you can sort of be ready when those calls come in. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. I know that there's probably questions during the seminar, and although this display is for GoToWebinar, which we're not using anymore, but the point is, if you have questions, please feel free to type them in the box. I'll probably try to answer them at the very end. I try not to interrupt in the middle. I have everybody on mute, which is the normal way we do the webinars. But if you do have questions, please feel free to mash that question box and type in your question, and I will address it right at the end as soon as I finish up with the lecture, and I'll be on hand to answer as many questions that may pop up during the lecture. I'll be around to answer them, so please feel free. Also, if you probably heard about this webinar because you're a member of APCO, and if you are, then I'm glad to have you as a member of APCO. But if you're not a member of APCO, please think about becoming one. This webinar and hopefully the webinar series that we're going to have going forward are sort of the brainchild of the Training Task Force Committee that was set up by the Atlantic chapter of APCO. APCO is a great organization to be involved in, training, advocacy, networking, conferences, and other events, and all kinds of benefits that come to you as a telecommunicator when you join APCO. It's not very expensive. It's like $8 a month. So If you're not a member of APCO, please think about, after the webinar is over, heading over to that website, www.apcointl.org/join, and you can join up right online, and I hope that you will if you aren't already, and thus end the commercial. So let's get on with it. We're talking today about bariatrics, and the word bariatrics, or bariatric medicine, refers to the specific area of medicine that deals with the treatment of obesity. And perhaps 30, 40 years ago, this was not a thing in the United States, but I can tell you right now, both anecdotally and also from a statistical point of view, it's getting to be, I shouldn't say it's getting to be, it's already a big problem in the United States. It's a problem that really started to develop around the late 1980s, early 1990s. That doesn't mean before that time that there weren't obese people in the United States, but the prevalency, the quantity or commonality of obese patients in the United States really started to ramp up around the early 1990s, and it's becoming a big problem today. We have a huge percentage of people in the United States who are diagnosed by a physician as obese, and it's getting worse. The numbers have flattened out a little bit, slightly, very slightly, over the past, let's say, 6 to 8 years. And there's some debate about why they've flattened out slightly. You know, some debate about government programs and other things, but even though it's flattened out slightly, it's still on the rise. From 91 to 98, the percentage of obese men in the United States doubled. And the percentage of obese women went up by 50%. And that's a lot in basically an 7-year time span. That is a big change compared to the way it was before. Huge. And as of 2016, which was the latest statistics I could sort of rustle up for this webinar from the CDC, the federal government says that more than a third, the actual number is 34.9%. 34.9% of U.S. adults are currently classified as obese. And of the remaining 2/3, you say, well, you know, that's a third, not great, but at least 2/3. Well, the second third of U.S. adults is considered overweight, above their target weight. Doesn't mean they're obese now, but it means they're sort of on the way, or maybe on the way. They're above the weight that they should be at. And that's a startling statistic to think that 35% of the U.S. population is now considered clinically obese. Now, clinically obese is complicated. A lot of times we hear folks ask, what is the number when you say, 35%? What's the number on the scale where, we say, well, if you hit that number on the scale, you're considered to be diagnosed or clinically obese, and therefore, you fall into that statistic. It's not actually a number on the scale. Doctors use a variety of, and obesity, technically speaking, is something that has to be diagnosed by a doctor, but doctors use a variety of methods to sort of arrive at that conclusion. The most common one is body mass index, or BMI, which takes into account your height and your weight and your age and all this stuff. BMI is a good measurement, a good way of gauging whether someone's obese or not, but it's not perfect, and there are some times when BMI is sort of faulty or sort of doesn't deliver the right conclusion, especially someone who's very big and muscular. If you get a guy like Arnold Schwarzenegger or something like that, if you look at the BMI, you say, holy cow, he's obese. He's not obese. He's in very good shape. So the BMI is not perfect, which is why doctors usually combine the BMI with some other things that they look at and sort of arrive at the conclusion. So there's no magic number on the scale where we say, that this person is obese, when they hit a certain number on the scale, and that's the bright line where they move from just overweight to obese, or just from regular weight to target weight to overweight. That being said, even though there's no specific number on the scale, sort of informally, when it comes to EMS and fire, a lot of EMTs and paramedics typically will say that if the person is above a certain weight, they will informally, in terms of their response, in terms of their operations in the field, they will sort of categorize that person as obese from a response point of view. That number is typically between 450 and 500 pounds. And the reason that number is sort of like maybe he's not clinically obese, but we're considering him obese anyway. The reason they sort of come to that conclusion is because, at least until recently, a lot of manufacturers of ambulance stretchers and stair chairs and other equipment like that, they would have, they have weight limits on those devices, and they're usually on a big label on the side. And when you buy it, they give you all sorts of warnings about what the maximum weight is. And until recently, most of those devices, those stretchers and stair chairs and things, were sort of rated to a maximum of mid 400 pounds, 450 to 500 pounds. And above that, the stretcher wasn't certified for use, or the stair chair or whatever it was, wasn't really designed for that. It's getting a little better. The ambulance equipment manufacturers like Stryker, Inferno, and those others, they are starting to offer a lot more in terms of devices, stretchers, and things that are capable of holding much more. We see some that go up to 1,100, 1,200 pounds. But certainly those are relatively new on the market, and a lot of EMS and fire agencies are still using the older style, or, to be honest, the cheaper style of ambulance stretcher and equipment where it's not really rated at holding that much. So even though there's no official line on the scale that determines a person to be obese, a lot of EMS and fire responders would say, well, once they start to get around 450, 500 pounds, we kind of have to treat them like they're obese regardless of the situation. So, but we have, an increasing number of people in the United States who are meeting that, whether they're clinically diagnosed as obese, as we see are 35%, and then certainly, regardless of what the statistics say, we also have a number of people in the United States who, whether they've been seen by a doctor or not, as far as the EMS and fire are concerned, they're obese because they're big enough that it's affecting the ability of fire and EMS to do their jobs. And that number is steadily increasing. It's gotten to the point in this country where we have an entire TV show, shown on a daily or weekly basis or whatever it is, where the show is about nothing but people who are extremely obese, extremely overweight, and they go and see a doctor who treats them with various procedures, including weight loss surgery. I mean, I'm not going to say the name of the TV show, but you probably know what it is. It's pretty well known. So it's definitely becoming a thing in the United States. I think at this point it's even more than a thing. It's getting towards the point where in the near future we may see more than 50% of the population, the majority of the population, categorized as obese or overweight or whatever it is. And that's very concerning. That's very concerning because these people are dialing 911. They're dialing 911 for a variety of things. I mean, regardless of your body size or weight, you could have all kinds of issues, police and law enforcement issues, fire department related issues. Obviously, when we think about obesity patients calling 911, a lot of the things we think about have to do with medical issues. After all, that's what bariatrics is about. We talk about bariatrics in terms of treatment of obesity and the medical issues that are associated with it. And there are a lot of risks that are associated with obesity. It doesn't mean that every person who's a little heavier on the scale necessarily suffers from any or all of these problems. But certainly there are people who are larger out there who are not necessarily in infirm health. They're not dying. But certainly they are at a higher risk. And because they're at a higher risk, this one is not in particular proven, but because they're at a higher risk, it stands to reason unofficially that they're going to dial 911 more often, although that hasn't been statistically proven. But we are getting calls from these folks. The challenge for us isn't so much that they call 911 more often, and I don't know if they do. I guess it depends on their individual health and their individual situation. But the problem is when they do call, they have special problems that make it more difficult for them when it comes to medical issues. And I do focus on medical issues in this webinar, but like I said, certainly there are plenty of issues that obese people might face just like any other person. And these are issues when, regardless of whether it's police, fire, EMS related, when they call, it becomes a challenge for us. We're going to talk about, all the things that they face and how to get out of the house. Fire and police could be just as similar of an issue if they have to deal with that person. But we'll jump into the medical stuff first, right? Overall, people with extreme obesity, with high levels of obesity, tend to have more heart issues, more cardiac issues. And these are the same issues that people of lesser weight, may have as well. But they tend to get it more frequently. There's an overall increase in both morbidity. And again, for those who didn't take medical terminology in college, morbidity means when you have something going on with your body that's making you sick, in which, for example, we say morbid obesity, right? When the obesity is starting to make you ill or cause health issues for you, we talk about the morbidity of it. And then, of course, mortality is when it kills you, when you die from it. Morbidity and mortality. But certainly, there's an overall increase in the morbidity in the illnesses that these folks have. Again, not every single person, but frequently, that they have as a result of their weight. Coronary artery disease, arteriosclerosis, atherosclerosis, high cholesterol, high blood pressure, all these things that we sort of associate with poor cardiac health. Congestive heart failure. Remember, the heart has to push the blood a lot further when it comes to someone with a very large body mass or a very large girth. There's a lot more body area that needs to be provided with blood and oxygen, and that means the heart has to work extra hard to push the blood all the way out to where it needs to go at the ends of the body and throughout the whole body. And sometimes, that can put a big strain on the heart, especially when it comes to exertion, even small levels of exertion. For someone who's a little on the skinnier side, getting up out of a chair, getting into and out of a car, or going up and down the stairs is probably no big deal. Their heart's able to handle that with no issue. But when you have someone with a very large, when you have someone with a very large body mass with a very large bodily size, and they have to go up and down the stairs or any other exertional activity, their heart, which is already under a bit of strain as it is, has to work that much harder because there's just more weight to move around, and that puts a bigger strain on the circulatory system. So we do sometimes see where the person's heart is not able to beat adequately enough to supply the whole body efficiently with oxygen, which is a very short definition of congestive heart failure. And of course, sudden cardiac arrest. We see that where people who have these cardiac issues, if they have a higher risk of having these cardiac issues, then logically they're at a higher risk of going into cardiac arrest and requiring CPR right away. The same thing regarding the lungs. The lungs, we sometimes see that the person who is very, very obese, who is very large, may have difficulty expanding their lungs with enough volume to provide them with the oxygen that they need. This is sometimes due to the fact that for these folks, sometimes the adipose fat, the organs and fat, will actually push up into the chest cavity and make it smaller and not get out of the way when the person wants to inflate their lungs and breathe. So for this person, they're not able to take as deep a breath, as it were, as a person who's skinnier because their lungs just can't inflate that much. There's just not much room for the lungs to inflate, and the chest cavity can't easily, expand outward and balloon outward like we see in someone who is not quite as big. And there's sort of a circular irony. Again, we said this person typically needs more oxygen and blood flow for smaller levels of exertion, like getting in and out of a car or going up the stairs, because they have more mass and girth to move around, so it's a vicious cycle. Their body needs more oxygen in the bloodstream to do what it needs to do because of the added weight, and their lungs already have a whammy going against them because they're not able to inflate as easily in some cases as you would see in a skinnier person. So it's like a double whammy against this victim's ability to breathe adequately. And certainly if there's other factors like infection or anything else like that, it's going to be even worse. Sometimes we see that where these folks, they have an infection in the lungs and they have a mucus buildup, or they have an asthmatic situation or whatever it is, and there's that liquid or fluid in the lungs, or congestive heart failure, all these things that can cause a fluid or mucus buildup in the lungs, where a skinnier person would be able to cough and expel that mucus or fluid. But with a person who has this, large girth, and they're not able to breathe quite as easily or adequately as a person who's of a lighter weight, and they're not able to expel that stuff out of their lungs, it just makes things worse overall, and they have a harder time getting over that sort of thing. Moving from medical issues to trauma injury, to traumatic injury, we do see problems with traumatic injuries in obese patients, and there seems to be this sort of misguided, people are mistaken that, well, if someone who's very, very large, if they fall, they're quote unquote more padded, so there's less likely to be a fracture or something like that. First of all, that's kind of a lousy, it's kind of demeaning to the patient. But on top of that, even if it was true, it's not. the truth is that patients who have extreme obesity, if they fall or have another fall, car accident, something involving a trauma to the body, they're actually more likely to have fractures of the bones and joints, especially at the elbows and the ankles, because the bones and joints of the body in someone who's really that large, they really have that big of a girth, someone who's in that situation, the bones and joints are actually under a great deal of stress just on a day-to-day basis because of the added extra weight and strain on the body. The bones and joints already have kind of a hard enough time doing their job as it is because they're under such a buckling weight or such a buckling strain. And if the person falls or gets in a car accident or anything else like that, they're more likely to sort of give way and snap or dislocate because of the added strain. So when it comes to obesity, traumatic injury results in a higher percentage of joint and bone damage and injury. We also see that in car accidents where, these folks, a lot of them don't wear seatbelts. And that could be for a variety of reasons. Maybe because it's uncomfortable. Maybe because, there's not a whole lot of room to maneuver and they have a great deal of difficulty getting the buckle, finding the buckle and getting it in there. Maybe they physically are just large enough that the seatbelt is simply not long enough and won't secure. We do see that sometimes as well. Some folks will get the seatbelt extenders where it's supposed to make the seatbelt longer, but a lot of folks they just don't. They just say, forget it, I'm just not going to wear the seatbelt. And they're also typically much closer to the dashboard because of their size, right? Someone who's skinnier, if they sit back in the seat, they're further away from the dashboard, and if there is an accident, there's more time for their body to travel towards the dashboard. There's more time for the airbag to inflate, and all those sort of things. But if you're very big, then you're going to be closer to the dashboard, and that means that you're more likely to impact the dashboard, possibly even before the airbag has a chance. Excuse me. Before the airbag has a chance to even fully inflate, and that means you're more likely to impact the dashboard and have a more severe injury. And sometimes when the responders get there, it isn't always obviously easy to tell whether the person has internal fractures or injuries. On someone who is skinnier, who has less girth, it may be easier to see the bruising and bleeding beneath the skin and things like that we would associate with internal injuries. But if somebody really is that large and they have a lot of subcutaneous fat, sometimes the injury is deep inside and it's not always so obvious from the surface that the person is injured. And, then the person says, well, I'm fine, I'd rather go home or whatever it is. And then they end up having severe complications or possibly even dying later because no one realized that they had internal injuries. They have a higher chance of chest and head injuries. They have a higher frequency of pelvic fractures. And regardless of whether we're talking about medical or trauma, people with these sorts of obesity conditions are just less easily able to bounce back and get better when problems occur. Again, as we said, their bodily systems are already sort of under a strain as it is on a good day. They're already sort of pushed a little further than a person who's not quite as heavy. And when they do have a medical or trauma situation that causes issues for their bodily organs, it's that much harder for them to compensate and bounce back. And that means they're more likely to crash and possibly die. So putting aside the sort of medical issues of it, putting aside the medical educational part of it, overall, logistically speaking, dealing with these sorts of incidents is just more difficult. It's just not as easy. There's typically long delays due to problems with moving and transport. Excuse me. We have to figure out how to get this person out of the house into a vehicle, and again, they may not fit in our typical vehicle. And then we got to transport them appropriately sized stretcher and other stair chair, whatever must be available, or certainly the regular stretcher might not be good enough. Even when you do get them back into the vehicle, which again, typically, especially for this webinar, I'm discussing EMS, so the ambulance is sort of where we're focusing. But regardless of what kind of what the story is, if you're getting them into the back of an ambulance, you might be able to fit them in there, but there might not be sufficient room for the crews to adequately be secured, or they might not be able to get access to, give IVs or take blood pressures or things like that because of there not being enough clearance in the back of the ambulance to sort of get access. So that's a big challenge, and certainly mobilizing additional personnel. I mean, typically these incidents require a lot of extra personnel, a lot of extra responders, because you just need more hands to do a lot of lifting and a lot of carrying and a lot of moving and things like that. And that can be a real challenge. And that challenge can exist whether you're talking about a rural type of area or a suburban type of area with volunteer responders. And it can also exist if you're talking about a city with career responders. Ironically, in a volunteer system, you need more than one ambulance or whatever it is, so you can keep toning, you can keep paging, you can keep sending text messages, you can keep trying to rustle up the troops to come out from home or whatever your system does. And then sometimes in a career system, for those of us who've worked in career fire and EMS, and certainly I worked in career EMS around the New York City, in the Bronx and around the New York City metropolitan area for a number of years before coming to telecommunications. I could tell you sometimes when in a career system, if there's no ambulances available at the moment, you're not getting any more. There's no volunteers to turn out. There's no additional units or whatever. You have an X number of ambulances or fire trucks or whatever it is for your city, and short of the world coming to an end and somebody and a guy with a gold badge getting woken up in the middle of the night, other than that, you're not getting mutual aid. So, it can be very, very difficult to find enough manpower, especially if you have other calls holding in your area, right? If you have other fire, police, EMS dispatches waiting in your area, and now you're pulling every single fire truck and ambulance to a scene to deal with one incident, it can be very, very difficult. And again, this will apply. This will typically apply whether we're talking about police, fire, EMS incidents. I know I'm focusing on the EMS stuff today, but certainly when you're talking about, for example, a law enforcement situation, if somebody who's obese like this needs to be arrested, do you have the right equipment to restrain them? And how do you get them to where they're going if they don't fit in the back of a typical police car? Will they fit in the back of a paddy wagon? Some won't. And the same thing regarding, say, evacuation. If there's a mass evacuation, say like a weather-related incident or or something like that, how are you getting them there? Are you going to be able to get them out of there? And if you do get them there, wherever they're going, hospital, jail, evacuation center, wherever it is, is that destination going to have the right equipment and manpower, the right setup to handle these incoming people? And that's obviously a consideration as well. Is your local jail equipped to handle someone who's obese like this? Because I can tell you right now, I don't know if our jail is, and that's an issue. That's an issue. So all these things that we sort of have to worry about when it comes to these folks. Turning back to the medical part of it for a minute regarding managing the airway, I know a lot of us are using EMD, and if you're not using EMD, I hope you get EMD because it's a good thing. But if you are using EMD, you probably have a card in your card set for cardiac arrest and unconscious that says something like, tilt the head, one hand on the forehead, one hand under the neck, and tilt the patient's head all the way back until it doesn't go anymore, right? Well, that works fine for patients of a quote-unquote more normal weight, but for a patient who's very obese, for a bariatric patient, airway control can be very difficult. These patients typically have a neck that is very short, squat, and they say is a quote-unquote no neck, right? But the shoulders tend to be very bulky, and the neck is almost non-existent in some patients, and there's really just not that much movement in the neck to tilt back. And when you go to open the airway, nothing happens, right? The airway is still not open, and basic airway maneuvers just really don't work all that well on some of these patients. It can be very, very difficult for responders and EMDs to get the airway open. Even paramedics, somebody say, well, we'll call for an ALS unit, and the paramedic will put in a breathing tube, right, and endotracheal intubation, right? And that sounds good, but I can tell you right now, for some of these patients, even endotracheal intubation is very difficult. They're not able to tilt the patient's head back sufficiently enough in the field to adequately secure the patient's airway, and that can be a huge problem. You can see here in this photo how this patient's airway might be very difficult to control in an emergency because his head simply doesn't tilt all that far back. And I can tell you right now from personal experience that managing this patient's airway in an emergency situation would be very difficult, especially in the field, let alone in the hospital. You can see here how they've padded under his back, his upper back, and so forth with blankets. The idea being that if you can sort of prop up his upper shoulders, then his head will flop back a little bit, naturally. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't, but typically from the EMD point of view, we typically tell the patient not to put any pillows or anything under the patient because A, for CPR compressions, and also B, because typically the pillow pushes the patient's head forward and, and closes the airway. So this could be very, very difficult for the EMD. And it's something that isn't easily addressable in the EMD environment, in my opinion, although if you have a method of addressing this in your EMD card set for someone who's very obese, I'm very interested in hearing it. Please feel free to email me and let me know. Okay, so aside from airway control, when it comes to other challenges for EMS, obviously we have to transport, the EMS responders have to transport the patient, but it's not just transporting. You can't just say, oh, what we'll just put them in the back of the rescue truck, or we'll put them on a flatbed or something like that. There's problems with that. That's not safe for the patient. That's not safe for the responders. And it's also kind of disrespectful to the patient. And obviously I know that, respect for the patient situation may not be priority number one on our list, but it certainly should be in that list somewhere. You got to at least have a modicum of dignity for the patient. It's not their fault that they're having a medical emergency, and they don't need to be paraded around like a cargo load. It's just not appropriate. And certainly there's a risk to responders as well. There's some studies out there that estimate at least 50% of EMS responder workers' comp claims are caused by injuries that result from moving patients. Now, I'm quite sure that not all of those are due to moving obese patients, obviously. That's not a small subset. But certainly with obese patients, it is much more difficult, and they are more likely to get injured when it comes to moving these victims because of the added work and the added exertion and so forth. That could be a real challenge. So that being said, when it comes to these sorts of calls for EMS, ideally we would like to have a pre-planned method for appropriately handling these patients, and that stretches all the way from dispatch all the way through arrival at the destination. Now, your local police, fire, EMS agency may already have a plan for how they address these incidents, and if they do, I'm very glad to hear it. But even if they do, you may want to think about expanding that plan to include the dispatch portion of it, which we'll talk about in a minute. Or if they don't have a plan, at least you could try to work with them to create a plan that involves dispatch, and we'll talk more about that in the last part of the presentation. But either way, even if you create a pre-planned method for dealing with these sorts of incidents, excuse me, even if you're going to create a pre-plan or a procedure or whatever it is, all the planning in the world is not going to negate the fact that even with the best intentions, the best planning, these calls are going to take a lot more time, a lot more effort, and a lot more field personnel than other EMS calls. And again, the same goes for fire and evacuation, police, whatever it is calls. They take longer, they take more equipment, they take more people, they take more time, they take more resources. That's just the way it goes. Certainly the personnel can be a challenge. These calls tend to be labor intensive. They're not easy calls. They're sometimes unpleasant calls. A lot of times we see with EMS and fire responders, they don't want to go to these calls. They don't like going to these calls because it involves a lot of hard work, which not everybody wants to do. Also, a lot of these EMTs and paramedics and firefighters are kind of blessed with newer equipment that they typically use on a daily basis, which makes it less necessary for them to break their backs lifting victims of any size. They have electrically powered stretchers and stair chairs with tracks on them and things that they can sort of slide down the stairs and things like that. And that's great, but for a lot of these obese patients, that equipment can't be used because the patient is too large or doesn't fit or it's not practical or whatever it is. And that means that the EMS and fire personnel have to go back to using sort of the old manual way of doing things, and that's not fun. I mean, if you're used to having an easier time with these sort of assistive equipment, and now you don't have a chance to use that equipment, and you kind of have to do it the old-fashioned way, that can be disappointing. And of course, there is an element, unfortunately, of personal bias. Some responders and even dispatchers, this fat guy, we got to take him. It's ridiculous. I'd like to mention, by the way, that, there is this sort of social stigma associated with people in obesity, and it's not just about, oh, if you're the guy who just stopped eating. It's not really that simple. It really isn't. There are plenty of people who have obesity issues who don't necessarily eat like a poor diet or whatever. I'm sure some of them do, obviously, but certainly there are people who eat. There are people who eat well and exercise well, and they still struggle with obesity. It's obviously not due, and doctors admit they don't 100% understand how obesity is caused and how it's treated and everything. If it was just based on a diet alone, then weight loss would be very easy. You could just eat certain foods or eat a little less, and that would be the end of it. But I don't know, I think almost everybody in the world struggles, or at least in our country, struggles with with weight issues, and it certainly isn't due to you could diet all you want. For some people, losing weight, it can be very, very difficult. So I think it's fair to say that doctors don't 100% understand what causes obesity, and it isn't as simple as just, putting down the fork or whatever. It's a challenge. There are plenty of people who have obesity issues, even though they're not, they don't stuff their face. And we need to recognize that these people need our help and deserve the same treatment that we would give to anybody else without the personal bias. And that could be a challenge for some people. We need to kind of try and work past that. And it becomes an issue. In some agencies, they say, well, what we'll do is we'll just send one of the big ambulances. This is an ambulance. We're very lucky around here. We're a mostly volunteer EMS system, and we're very lucky around here to have most of the agencies equipping the larger size modular ambulances. This is a 1284 Type 3 ambulance, which is very, very common in my area. And if you're an EMS or if you're an EMT or paramedic and you've worked in the system, these are probably the nicest for the EMT and paramedic to work in. They have the most room in the back, and they're the most spacious in the back. They have that square back. This is not one of those vanbulances, as they say, where there's very little room to work. This is the nice area in the back. But that being said, this vehicle what we're looking at right now is very typical. The back doors open up to an opening that's between 40 and 44 inches, typically speaking, depending on the model. And the ambulance weight is rated for 1,600 pounds. Now, when we talk about patients who are very obese, say, well, 44 inches and 1,600 pounds. I mean, obviously, this vehicle is enough to handle whatever you throw at it. Not so much. It's not so clear when you think carefully about it. If you have a patient who weighs 700 pounds, that person may have a girth, may have a width of 50 to 55 inches. Suddenly, that 44 inches opening that we have in the back of the ambulance there looks very small all of a sudden. And the same thing regarding the weight. The patient weighs 700 pounds, and now I have 2 or 3 responders, a driver and 1 or 2 EMTs or paramedics or whatever they are. That could easily be 600 pounds by itself for those responders. Now you're at 1,300 pounds, and don't forget, the ambulance is already laden down with a stretcher and a stair chair and all kinds of equipment that they're required to carry in their ambulance. And all of a sudden, that 1,600-pound weight limit doesn't look so high. It looks kind of scary, actually. Like, wait a minute, are we able to do this? So that is a challenge. And just saying, oh, well, we have big ambulances is not necessarily good enough. It could be a real problem, and you don't want to be overloading that ambulance. Even if the patient's physical size, they're able to fit through that opening. But if you're going to be over your rated weight limit for the ambulance, you don't want to be in that situation. You don't want to be on the highway in the middle of nowhere, and all of a sudden, the transmission gives out, or the engine blows up, or the axle breaks, or the tire pops, or whatever it may be. That would not be good. So a regular ambulance isn't necessarily the answer here. As certainly the removal of the victim to an appropriate vehicle can also be a challenge. A good number of these patients, especially the ones who are very, very obese, they may have difficulty walking, or they may not be able to walk at all. Even if they are able to walk for short times, or you're able to get them to stand up and sit down on a stretcher or a litter or whatever it is, they may not be able to fit through the doorway to their residence or to the building that they're in. And we sometimes see that with patients who are in their homes or whatever, and they are unable to leave for long stretches of time because they're physically unable to fit through the doorway. And that could present a huge. I remember one of my last patients like this years ago. Lived on a walk up on the number 3 floor in an apartment in Rockland County, and it was a big challenge. He was non-mobile, and he hadn't been out of his bed for some time, and it was a big challenge to get him out and down the stairs and to the ambulance and everything else. So it can be a real problem. Some agencies say, well, we'll do in that situation. We don't really need a plan. What we'll do in that situation is we'll just call the fire department, and they'll either, they'll cut away the door, or they'll cut away the window, or they'll cut away a hole in the side of the building. It's not so clear to just sort of say, well, the fire department will handle it. First of all, you need a fire department or technical rescue team that is able to do that. Not all fire departments are necessarily equipped right off the bat to do that sort of thing. Some of them are more oriented towards fire suppression and not that sort of heavy rescue. On top of that, even if your agency does have a tech rescue team or something like that, it's not so simple. Just cutting away a hole in the side of a building or taking out a door or window, you're talking about compromising the structural integrity of the building, and that could be a big risk for responders, for the patient, for the crews. That is a very risky situation. As far as I know, most firefighters are not building engineers or architects. I mean, maybe your fire department has people who are trained in building engineering, and if so, that's great. But I think it's fair to say most fire departments don't. A firefighter, at least, isn't guaranteed to be a building engineer, and that could be very dangerous. And certainly, even if you do figure out a way to do it, and you make the proper preparations and everything else, that takes a long time and a lot of equipment and a lot of effort, and there could be a lot of safety risks associated with that. So again, the more you have this pre-planned out as to what you're going to do in this situation, the better, because you don't want to be standing, you don't want to have your responder standing there in the middle of the incident and not know what to do. When it comes to the equipment, a lot of agencies are accustomed to using the standard backboard to take patients out of residences when they're non-mobile. And again, this can be pluses and minuses with the obese patient. There are some situations where the patient simply is too big to fit on the board. Those boards are relatively narrow and they just don't fit, and that's a problem. The board also has to be able to support the weight of the victim. Now, I know a lot of agencies are using those ABS plastic backboards in bright colors, orange and red and all that. That's fine. Does your board have a weight limit? I could tell you that your board does have a weight limit. It's something that's going to be set by the manufacturer, although the ABS board, the plastic boards, are typically more forgiving than the wooden boards. If your agency is still using wooden board, if your responding EMS agency or fire agency is still using wooden boards, and I know for a fact there are some out there that still do, you really should think about switching to plastic. But I can tell you right now, for a lot of these patients, wood is a no-go. The board will break or splinter, and it's not going to work out. Even if they're able to fit on the board and the board is able to tolerate the weight, remember the rescuers are going to be carrying that backboard using those molded grips on the side, those molded the handholds on the side. And if the patient's girth is such that the responders aren't able to slip their hand in and grab those handles, then it's not going to be very helpful. They're not going to be able to carry the victim. I know some agencies will use straps and use them to cradle the thing like a sling, and whatever. It's very difficult. So all things to think about that. Some patients who are very obese are not able to lie down flat for any reason. Either their the curvature of their spine and shoulders is at a point where they can no longer lie flat because their bones simply don't go that way. Or even if they are, sometimes the shifting body weight from their organs on their lungs and heart make it impossible for them to breathe when they're lying down. So some patients aren't able to lie down flat. So what do? Well, you can pat up behind their head, you can do other things, but it just adds more complexity to the case and makes things take longer and more complicated and everything else. So what do they do when they need to move a non-mobile patient, an obese patient, out of the building? There are a couple of equipment options out there, and again, your agencies in the field will have differing options, and it's a good idea as a dispatcher to know who has what, so you can know who to send in case they're needed. Here we see one device which some agencies equip for bariatric patients. This is called a walkboard, W-A-U-K, walkboard. It's a brand name. As you can see, it's basically just an ABS backboard, spine board, with a foothold on the bottom and wheels. And the idea, this is supposed to be more of like an emergency evacuation device in like a nursing home or something like that. But it has strict limitations. Again, it's the size and shape of a regular backboard. So if you have an obese patient who wouldn't fit on a regular backboard, then the walkboard, maybe it'd be a little easier to carry them down because you can wheel them down, but the walkboard isn't going to help you from a size point of view. And we also see situations where the straps aren't long enough, right? Where the straps are simply not too short to wrap physically around the patient's body and secure them. And if you can't secure the patient to the backboard, then that's pretty much, that's going to be a waste of time. So I don't see this, although I know some agencies are carrying this as a bariatric option, I don't see this, aside from maybe sharing the weight load a little bit as you roll down the stairs, I don't see this as being a super helpful option for dealing with bariatric patients. Some agencies call for their rescue or fire department and they want to use a Stokes basket or Stokes litter to take these patients out. Again, severe limitations here. This basket is typically made out of ABS plastic and hollow aluminum tubing. And again, that aluminum tubing has a strict weight limit and it will bend or break if the weight limit, it may bend or break if the weight limit is exceeded. So you do want to be careful about that. Additionally, the sort of like bowl shape or cup shape typically makes it impractical for dealing with a bariatric person. And again, the issue with the seat belts possibly not being long enough is also of a concern. So I don't see this as being a fantastic option for dealing with bariatric patients, even though some agencies say that's what they want to use. The Reeve stretcher is an option some agencies are using. If you're not familiar with the Reeve stretcher, it's basically thick canvas that's been stitched together in a sheet, and then they put wooden slats inside the two layers of the sheet in the middle, sandwiched in the middle, to make it semi-rigid, but it sort of wraps around the victim and sort of mummies them or cocoons them, and then there are stitched canvas handles on the ends where you can carry the victim. They're frequently used for patients in the field, but some agencies say that they're going to use this for bariatric patients. Again, similar to the other options. If the canvas is not strong enough, if the wood slats break, if the straps aren't long enough to wrap around, and it's not really going to be very helpful. And again, like the Stokes basket, this device kind of has to wrap around the victim to some extent in order to be useful. So if the patient is of a size where you're not able to really wrap the Reeve stretcher around the victim, not really going to be a good option. What we do see out there in the field are very, very large sheets and flexible transfer devices, bariatric transfer sheets and things like that, which can be used to move victims. We do see them out there. These aren't perfect either, and the reason I say that is because A, few ambulances in my experience are equipped with them, although that's starting to change a little bit. Also, B, they are canvas, and they do have a lot of handholds, but they are canvas and they can rip. They also typically don't have straps. And you have to remember, these bariatric transfer devices are really designed for use in a hospital setting. And I know EMS agencies are carrying them, and obviously it's better than nothing, but they're strapless because, you know, in a hospital situation, if you're moving from one bed to the bed next door or whatever it is, you're not going too far, and they don't usually bother with straps. That's not a real good solution for EMS and fire. Typically, we want the person to be strapped in so we can maneuver them around stairs and things like that. And a lot of times they'll put a backboard in the middle and try to secure the patient to the backboard, or at least provide more, more safety to the patient by putting them on the backboard, as we see in the photo here. But it's far from perfect. That being said, if your responders have this available to them in the field on some of their ambulances or fire trucks, it would be very nice if these ambulances and fire trucks could be dispatched to the scene with this equipment so that it's ready to go when the time comes. But again, it's not always available. It would behoove the dispatch center to know which vehicles have this sort of thing. And there are some other options out there you might see. There's slings and various cranes and jacks and things like that, but these are not commonly found in the field. These are mostly hospital-based or nursing home-based, and we don't see them out in the field. They're not practical for use on board an ambulance or a fire truck. So all that being said, what should the dispatch agency do? What can the dispatch agency do regarding these sorts of incidents? Well, first of all, follow your local procedure. If you have a local plan set up or you have a local procedure set up, be sure to follow it. If you don't have a local plan set up or you don't have a procedure or anything else like that, maybe think about creating one for your PSAP. Maybe thinking about creating something like a bariatric response plan so that you're ready when these sorts of calls come in. Again, I think it's sooner rather than later. It's going to happen where you're going to get these one-off calls. And ideally, I would strongly recommend that you work with your local responders, especially your fire and EMS, but even law enforcement as well. I would recommend that you work with your local police, fire, and EMS to sort of develop that plan. And if they have a plan already on the field side, maybe just integrate yours with theirs. If they don't have anything formal, maybe consider creating one for everybody, dispatch and the three types of field responders. But certainly create a plan. One of the challenges with this sort of planning is how you're going to obtain information about the patient's obesity. You know, ideally, we would be able to activate this plan at the dispatch center, at the PSAP, during the call intake process. So before you don't want to have to wait until the responders get to the scene, so you dispatch them, you interview the caller, you dispatch the responders get to the scene. Only now, after they finally got to the scene, now all of a sudden they're like, wait a minute, the patient is very obese and we need, a lot of resources, and now I got to start working on that and make things take much longer. But it would be nice if we could get that information during the call intake process so that we could make the whole, situation move as fast as possible. That's a challenge because it can be awkward or uncomfortable to get that information over the phone. And your center, your PSAP, should really determine how, if anything, it wants to ask regarding that question. Now, some agencies just keep an address database, or they put it in their CAD system so that it pops up, when they're going to 123 Main Street or whatever it is, this particular address, the bariatric plan will be needed. There's challenges with that, and certainly that's something we're thinking about doing with our municipality. Our county has a special needs registry for people who are, who are bedridden or who are on ventilators and things like that. And we're thinking about working with them to create an obesity flag there as well. But there's challenges. Remember, these folks frequently are sick, especially if they're the ones who are calling 911. That means they're probably sick, or they have a lot of issues, or they have at least some issues. And that means there's a chance they might go to the hospital, they might move away, they might pass away, right? We see that sometimes also. So somebody has to be verifying that information to make sure that it's still valid. You don't want to have a situation where they go out to the address and it turns out the guy passed away 3 months ago, and I boiled up all this mutual aid and everything else for nothing, because it turns out that he or she doesn't live there anymore. Same thing regarding the people at the residence, right? If I get a call from 123 Main Street, there might be a family living there. And yes, one of the members of the family is bariatric, is obese, but the other members of the family aren't. And then, you end up spinning up this whole mutual aid for nothing, because it turns out the person's daughter or sister or mother or whatever it is who's not obese is the one who needs the ambulance or whatever. So that could be a challenge as well. So again, how do you query the caller about that on the phone? And that could be, the request of the caller. It could also be, you say, what we'll do is, sometimes we see that, we say, what we'll do is, if the caller says that the patient is overweight, if they blurt it out, that's when we'll activate the bariatric response plan. Good, but the problem is some people's idea of what counts as bariatric is not really qualifying for what we think of as bariatric. They say, well, he's very big, you're gonna need you need extra help. And then the crew gets there and they say, this is no big deal. It's not the end of the world. We can just take this guy. We don't need any of that additional units. And then you wasted all your resources sending them to the scene. And then they say, well, what we'll do is, if they say they're bariatric, if they say, oh, well, they're very overweight, you're going to need to send more help. What are you going to do then? You're going to start asking how heavy the patient is? I say, well, how big is he? Some agencies do that. Some agencies may choose not to do that. It's an awkward question to say, well, how many pounds is he? That can be very, very awkward. So it really depends on what your center wants to do. And, you might want to think about, if you are going to ask questions like that, you might want to think about putting them into your EMT card set, or otherwise codifying exactly what how you want the questions to be worded to avoid offending anyone. It would not be good if somebody called up and said, hi, I'm having chest pain, to be like, oh yeah, are you a big fat guy? That would not be good. A lot of people would say, unless they already know that they're overweight, a lot of people would be offended if you started asking them how heavy they were on 911 calls, which would not be good. So it can be a problem. You need to think about the way that your center can do this the best for your situation. The address one is very common, but again, it does come with significant drawbacks. Now that you've found out, hopefully, that the patient is bariatric, the patient is in need of additional assistance, what are you going to do? A lot of agencies will send the fire department to help, because typically they associate the fire department with rescue scenarios. That's fine. Some agencies do that. Some agencies will not call the fire department, or they will call the fire department, and then they'll just send additional EMS units. They'll send additional ambulances, either with or instead of the fire department, to sort of help with the extra staffing and hands that these sorts of calls typically need. If you're lucky enough in your dispatch area, in your municipality, to have a specialty bariatric ambulance at your disposal, obviously that would be ideal. Bariatric ambulances are typically larger, especially in the doorway openings, and they're typically equipped with special equipment, such as stretchers and things like that, that are especially designed to handle obese patients. Not every area has them. I strongly recommend that if you don't have a list of where and who to call for your local bariatric ambulance or your closest bariatric ambulance, even if it isn't local. That should definitely be, even if you're not going to develop a plan, I would definitely recommend keeping a list of those agencies that have a bariatric ambulance available in your system somewhere, in your computer or in your Rolodex or whatever your agency uses to keep track of these sorts of things, because when you need one, you need one. I can tell you, again, we're a small county in New York. We only have one bariatric ambulance available at one career agency. And they are, they're good. I mean, when we call for them, we call for that ambulance, they send it, but that ambulance is not staffed 24 hours a day. And typically when we call for it, they have to call in a crew in a regular ambulance to drive back to the base, get the bariatric ambulance, get it up and running, get it out to the scene, drive out. That could take some time. Again, if you can get this activated during the call intake process to sort of speed up the situation, that would be great, because then you don't have to have the responders tied up on scene for eons waiting for the responders to get there, waiting for the bariatric ambulance to get there. What do they have on board the bariatric ambulance? They typically have, at the bare minimum, a stretcher that is better able to handle a bariatric patient. This is an example of a stretcher from Furno. This is the Furno Large Body System Package, or LBS. And that name's a little on the nose for my taste. But anyway, this is the Furno LBS system. As you can see, it has a battery-powered motor for helping to lift the patient, and also it's got these sort of fold-out panels or flaps that are basically expand the width of the stretcher and make it a little more capable of handling a person with a very wide girth. And typically it comes with extra long seatbelt straps that you can fit onto it so that the patient can be safely secured to the panels. Another example from Stryker. This is the Stryker MX Pro with a bariatric package. You can see here that the stretcher's in the lowest position, in the fully collapsed position. And a lot of these stretchers, the maximum weight rating, which for some of these stretchers is 1,100, 1,200 pounds, the maximum weight rating is only valid when you have the stretcher down at its lowest setting, its collapsed setting, the lowest down to the floor. So typically what they do with this Stryker model is they give you, it doesn't have the flaps to support a wider patient, but it does have these sort of push me, pull you handles where you don't have to bend over and huff the patient along the ground while you're in a bent over position. You can sort of use these big handles to push and pull from a standing position. You can also see that this ambulance is equipped with an on-loading ramp so that you can roll the patient up into the ambulance, and that way you don't have to lift the patient with your back, which could be very difficult depending on how much manpower you have. You can see on the right-hand side of the screen at the loading lip of the ambulance floor, you can see there, this ambulance is not equipped with the electric winch, but it is an option. Some ambulances will come equipped with an electrically motorized winch that attaches to that handle, and that way what will happen is you can actually winch the patient into the ambulance, up the ramp and into the ambulance without having to kill yourself to struggle to push the patient into the ambulance due to the weight. And again, even with these additional options, this equipment, the special equipment and everything, it's going to take a lot of extra personnel to get that patient out of the residence, into the stretcher, and into the ambulance, and they're probably going to be tied up there for a long time. This example is out of Memphis. And you can see here, by the way, they're using a Type 3. It is a mini mod, so the doorway is going to be on the small side. The doorway is only going to be 40 inches. But you can see here that 40-inch doorway that we're so accustomed to putting patients through starts to look a lot smaller all of a sudden when you're talking about a patient who has a significant width, and that can be a real challenge. And just one more example we see here. This is a Schaefer mod with a lift gate. I haven't seen one of these in the field. If you have one of these in your response area, I would love to hear from you about it because I'm curious. But basically, this one is more like an elevator that lifts the patient up like a lift gate and puts them into the back of the ambulance. I have not seen one of these in person, although I'm told that they are out there. So your responders have gotten the patient into the ambulance or whatever other vehicle that they're in. So where are they going? Which hospitals in your area, or if you're talking about a law enforcement situation with the jails, or you're talking about an evacuation center with with evacuations, it's the same idea. But which facilities in your area are able to accommodate these victims? Not every facility is able to accommodate these victims, and it would be a shame to waste all this time and energy and everything else to take the victim and drive all the way down there, and then when you get there, the staff says, "Oh, you know what? Never mind. We can't take this person. You're gonna have to go somewhere else." That would not be good. And when they do get to their destination, is there going to be enough in terms of equipment and staffing at the site, at the drop-off site, to reverse the process, right? Sometimes what you have to end up doing is you have to end up sending the responders, the fire EMS or whatever, to the destination point as well. And sometimes that destination point is not in the primary response area of the first agency. So you kind of have to call mutual aid to meet them at the hospital or other destination when they get there. Now you got 2 fire departments tied up, or whatever the story is, it becomes very difficult. And with that being said, you got all these resources that are being committed to this call, whether it be on site or at the destination or on the way or whatever it is. Who's covering all the other calls in the meantime? This is a real headache for the dispatcher, for the telecommunicator, because they got to worry about the other 15 calls they have in the queue that are waiting to be dispatched on. And you know, you're going to get mutual aid, you're going to cycle your units around, whatever it is. This can be a real challenge, which again is one reason to have another good reason to have a proper plan at your PSAP as to what to do in terms of mutual aid. Maybe when you activate this plan, you should be moving in mutual aid units automatically to cover other calls in the district on a standby or a move up or whatever your agency does with that. All things you should think about potentially when you're developing your plan. Who's keeping that address list? If you're doing this based on address, if you're going to keep a database or in your CAD system or a Rolodex or whatever you're doing at your PSAP, who's keeping that list current and how are they keeping it current? Are you sending a letter every few months? Is your fire department doing a pre-plan where they stop by and knock on the door? You know, what are you doing with this? I know a lot of agencies are now doing this electronically. They're using things like Smart 911 and things like that. And if you have access to that, you know, where it emails the person and says, hi, like just to verify, could you please verify that, you know, this is still valid, it's all done electronically, and it integrates with your CAD system, that's great. If you don't have that, then you may have to do it some other way, you know, by paper or whatever else, and that's when you have to work on your end. But again, I recommend that you plan for this. What about privacy? You're going to be transmitting, you know, typically we want to dispatch our responders and let them know what's going on at the scene. Are you going to start, you know, ambulance 1, respond to 123 Main Street? You know, there's a guy who's very obese there. I mean, you have to be careful about professionalism and patient privacy. And again, regarding patient privacy inquiries, I'm not going to get into the legalities of that. You should consult your legal authority on that, but it's something to think about. What sounds most professional and is most appropriate from a privacy point of view in terms of communicating issues to responders, saying, hi, by the way, you're going to need more resources or whatever else it is. Also things to think about. So with all that being said, bottom line, if you don't have a bariatric response plan at your PSAP, please consider creating one, and please consider working with your local police, fire, EMS to develop that plan. Again, if they have a plan already and you just want to expand it to include the dispatch part of it, that would be great. If they don't have a formal plan, or if they don't want to work with you on it or whatever, maybe thinking about developing one in-house so that you'll be ready when these calls come in. Certainly at a bare minimum, even if you're not going to develop a full plan, or even if you do develop a plan, at a bare minimum, inventory those local resources like specialty hospitals, like your bariatric ambulances, things like that, so that when the responders do get there and they say, hey, you know, this guy is very big, we need more help and so forth, at least you'll be able to help them out with the equipment that they need, you know, responders and equipment that they need when they call for it. What will be the plan activation criteria, right? Are you going to do it based on address? Are you going to do it based on what the caller says? Again, things that you should think about when you're creating this plan. What resources are you going to need? You're going to need more ambulances, you're going to need tech rescue, whatever it is. Privacy and accuracy of the information, and of course, always the headache of the telecommunicator, especially in a busier system, the resource management. How are we going to make sure that we can cover all our calls that may be going on at the same time when we're dealing with this very resource-intensive call and it's tying up all of our police, fire, and ambulance at the scene for an extended period of time? That's it for me. I hope you enjoyed this presentation on considerations for receiving calls about bariatric or obese victims. There's my contact information up there again on the screen. Again, I encourage you, if you have questions or if you, you know, if you have any feedback or anything else like that, please feel free to drop me an email. I'm always happy to hear from anyone who writes in. And of course, as I said, we post all of our training opportunities on Facebook first. So if you get a second, go over on Facebook and hit us up at 44 Control and follow that page. And we do hope to see you at our next training opportunity, whether it be in person or online. We're very much looking forward to it. Thanks, folks. Have a great one.